actually the 99th year we're in of this endowment for this lectureship. And the Dwight Terry Lectureship was established, obviously then, in 1905 by a gift from Dwight Harrington Terry of Bridgeport, Connecticut, to endow a series of lectures on religion and its application to human welfare in the light of scientific knowledge and philosophical insights, and thus bridging much of what we do here at Yale University. The lectures are published in book form by Yale University Press, and over the years we've had a distinguished series of lecturers, and were I to sit here and listen to these lecturers, I would feel somewhat daunted. We've had Margaret Mead, Paul Tillich, John Dewey, Carl Jung, Stephen Jay Gould, Reinhard Niebuhr, G.G. Simpson, Eric Fromm, and Rebecca West, among others, very distinguished lecturers. Today's lecturer is David Sloan Wilson, who holds a position as Professor of Biological Sciences and a joint appointment in the Anthropology Department at Binghamton University in New York State. David is also the director of EvoS, a program founded in 2003 that seeks to make evolutionary theory part of the common discourse for all subjects relevant to human affairs in the natural world. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester in 1971 and his Ph.D. from Michigan State University in 1975. He's author of a number of books, among them The Natural Selection of Populations and Communities. He's a specialist in group selection theory and the resuscitation of group selection theory in biology. A book called Unto Others, The Evolution and Psychology of Unselfish Behavior, and probably his most famous book, which is the book Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, published in 2002. I recently inquired at the Yale bookstore, and they did not have any copies in stock, but they, as a result of these lectures, are rushing to do so, and within a couple of days, there should be a shipment of Dr. Wilson's book at the bookstore. David Wilson is currently working on another book called The Literary Animal, The Evolution and the Nature of Narrative, with Jonathan Gottschall. And this will be an effort to look at literature in the same vein that he's been looking at other areas of human endeavor and human society in an evolutionary perspective. Finally, I just want to say that he is a past Guggenheim Fellow, the Vice President of the American Society of Naturalists in 1977, and the recipient of SUNY's Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Creative Activities. I'm going to lay out very quickly the program for lectures over the next 2 weeks. These lectures are held on Tuesdays and Thursdays of 2 consecutive weeks. I want to first of all say that following today's lecture and the subsequent lectures, there will be a reception, unfortunately not in this hall, not in Luce Hall, but across Prospect Street, which is over that way, at 124 Prospect. So you should go out the set of doors on the north side of the building, turn left, walk across Prospect Street, walk across the parking lot, and you should see the door for 124 Prospect Street. And another word from our sponsor. Following the lecture, there will be a question period. If there's anyone who wishes to carry on further discussions with Dr. Wilson or has further questions, please go to the Terry website, www.yale.edu/Terry lecture, and follow the instructions to get onto the interactive website with Dr. Wilson. This is a way to extend and expand the dialogue. As I said, this will be a series of 4 lectures. Today, Dr. Wilson will be talking about, his topic rather will be a sociological breakthrough, how to make evolution part of the common language of academic and everyday life. Thursday at 4:30, all of the lectures here in Luce Hall. Thursday at 4:30, groups as organisms and organisms as groups. And then next week on Tuesday, January the 25th, the human social organism. And finally, on Thursday the 27th, applied evolutionary theory. I think I've spoken long enough, and I, by the way, am Leo Hickey, who's in the geology and geophysics department. You can see how broadly the net of the Terry Lectures is cast in this regard. And without any further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, David Sloan Wilson. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much. Of course, it's a great honor to be asked to give these lectures, and humbling to stand in the shadow of such distinguished predecessors. The broad theme of my talks is stated here: how evolutionary theory provides a common language for the study of all subjects relevant to human affairs in the natural world. And this model can be broken into two parts. The first is the general goal of integration. How can we possibly escape the specialization of knowledge which has been taking place for so long, resulted in the major disciplines as we know them, such as anthropology, psychology, and so on, and ever finer subdivisions as the volume of knowledge explodes? Is there any way to achieve some kind of more holistic view of life in general and human life? Secondly, the possibility of evolutionary theory in particular as a way to achieve integration. Now, the goal of integration, of course, is very close to the mission of the Terry Lectureship, as we just heard. And interestingly enough, so also is evolutionary theory, because even though evolution is not mentioned by name, it turns out that a surprising number of previous Terry lecturers have addressed the subject of evolution, from J.A. Thompson in 1924 all the way up to Francisco Ayala just a few years ago. Evolution, more than any other subject, is the subject that the Terry Lectureship has returned to again as again as somehow fundamental to the integration of science with these older traditions of religion and philosophy. Nevertheless, and of course this is, I think, the Terry Lectureship stands as a microcosm for intellectual history in general. And ever since Darwin, it's been clear that there were momentous consequences for our understanding of all things human. And of course we've been trying to achieve that understanding all along, but it stubbornly refuses to be realized. The integrative potential of evolutionary theory stubbornly refuses to be realized. I was very interested to read George Gaylord Simpson's book from the Terry Lectures, one of the books that became a true classic. He said, "In the present study, the factual truth of organic evolution is taken as established, and the inquiry goes on from there." That was in 1949, and here we are 56 years later, and guess what? Creationism is still alive and well, stronger than ever, perhaps. And it's easy to be smug about creationists, but it gets worse. If you look at those who accept the fact of evolution, the great majority usually don't relate it to matters of importance in their own lives. For them, evolution is about dinosaurs and fossils and people evolving from apes. But if you ask them if evolution has anything to do with the paper that you open or current affairs or how you regard your life or your work, in most cases the answer would be no. And it gets worse. Very interesting lack of integration within academia, even within the biological sciences. You might think that Dobzhansky said in the 1970s, had a famous quote that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. But the fact is that there's plenty of integration that's still in progress within the biological sciences. Our best model of integration is in the fields of ecology, evolution, and behavior. I just had lunch with Gunter, and he said, no, ecology is not very well integrated. But the integration that took place didn't really come together until, I would say, the 1960s or the 1970s. Development and evolution. There's a catchy phrase, Evo-Devo, representing the integration of evolution and development. And that phrase, I believe, came about in the 1990s. molecular biology and the health sciences are enormously sophisticated, incredibly sophisticated in their study of proximate mechanisms, but they're not well integrated for the most part with other aspects of evolutionary biology. So the field, for example, the term Darwinian medicine is another phrase that was coined in the 1990s and is still not in the curricula of most medical schools. As we move from the biological sciences to the so-called human sciences, it gets worse. All of these subjects, traditional divisions of the human sciences, of course, from the very beginning, there have been efforts to integrate evolution with these topics, but for the most part, they failed. And so the terms evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology, in their modern usage, date about to the 1990s. They have an air of heresy about them. And so much of this integration is still in the future. It's very easy to get your Ph.D. in these disciplines without ever having a course in evolution or using the E word. As we move from the human sciences to the so-called humanities, an interesting distinction that we need to think about in our quest for integration, it gets worse. So much so that really many people wouldn't know what you would mean to say that you might are approaching literature or music or dance from an evolutionary perspective, or it might even invoke great hostility, as it does, for example, in cultural studies, a great taboo about Darwinism. I spent a lot of time on these subjects, and so I know from experience. Leo mentioned an edited book that's just coming out on literature from an evolutionary perspective, and publishing that book was an amazing ordeal. So I have firsthand experience for just how controversial it is to approach these studies from an evolutionary perspective. I'll be talking about religion in detail mostly during my third lectures. So what we see 50 years after Simpson, 80 years after Thomson, is still failures of integration, especially for human-related topics. And this is a real puzzle. You know, it's perfectly possible that we could go 50 more years and someone else will be standing here more or less saying the same thing. And so we really want to know, what are the limiting factors that are preventing progress from being more rapid? There's the usual list of subjects. For example, we might say that all of these topics are so difficult, there's not enough information, there might be challenges studying these subjects scientifically, especially humans. And I think that these might be true to a degree, but they're really missing the point, and we're not identifying the true limiting factors, which instead are elsewhere and more interesting. So what I want to establish today is that the limiting factors, I think, are primarily psychological and sociological, and most importantly, they can be circumvented. I want to show that numerous individuals are already functioning as what I call extreme integrationists, in the sense that Darwin was, as I will shortly describe. I want to establish that students can be taught to function as extreme integrationists in a single semester. Also, that integration can be implemented at a university-wide scale. So it's possible for integrated evolutionary studies to take place at the scale of an entire university, as we're trying to do with EvoS. And with EvoS and other programs, that there's already working models from which to borrow. So what this means is that I think that the future pace of integration can be much faster than the past. If this lecture differs from previous Terry lectureships on biology, it's in its practical nature. What I think I can do is to establish something close to a how-to manual for achieving integration based on elements which already exist. And I will sketch that out for you in this lecture. I'll try to flesh it out in my subsequent lectures, and in the book that will be published in the series, I will try to accomplish this in book form. So to substantiate these claims, let me go back to good old Charles Darwin. Everyone loves to go back to Charles Darwin. And I think it's very important to remember that he functioned as an extreme integrationist from the very beginning. He himself regarded his theory, he called it one long argument. Everything fit into one long argument. And what do I mean by extreme integration? All taxa were open to his study. He could study barnacles on Monday, orchids on Tuesday, earthworms on Wednesday, birds on Thursday. So whatever he had allowed him to transcend taxonomic groups. Also all subjects. He could study pollination on Monday, biogeography on Tuesday, weaponry on Wednesday. Somehow he was able to incorporate all subjects and include humans along with the rest of life. So at the same time that he was soaking seeds to see how long they'd survive in seawater, he was sending questionnaires to military officers in the far-flung outposts of the British Empire, asking them to look at the emotional expressions of the native inhabitants there, because he thought that there was an innateness to emotional expression. And he was doing actual research on human aspects of humanity and thinking hard about moral sentiments and quoting philosophers of his time at the same time as he was studying sex in barnacles. And this is so amazing, because this is the dream of integration that we hold in the future. This is what we want to achieve, basically. And it's what Darwin was doing, already doing. So how can we explain this kind of transdisciplinarity? And there's the usual explanations. Of course, maybe Darwin was just one hell of a great guy, and he was, make no mistake. But I think it's also a mistake to interpret this kind of integration purely to his personal attributes. I think that would be unfortunate, of course, because that's something we can't really emulate. Another possibility is that there was less knowledge back then, and so with less to learn, it was possible to be more of a generalist. And this might also be true to a degree. But the really interesting possibility, because it's the possibility that we can copy and emulate, is that there's something about the theory which enabled him to be so integrative, and that this was possible even in its most rudimentary form. Because after all, Darwin didn't even know about genes. There was all kinds of stuff that he didn't know about. So whatever he knew about evolutionary theory was just the kernel of evolutionary theory. And yet this was enough for him to function in a way that we dream about in the future. Isn't this interesting? I think that this is a fascinating juxtaposition of possibilities. Now, if we fast forward to the present, what we discover is that it is common, not at all unusual, for modern evolutionary biologists to transcend taxa and subjects in the style of Darwin. Now, clearly, there's some people that choose a particular system and they stick with it their whole life. There's great advantages to that, all kinds of factual knowledge, techniques that you can build up. But it's very common for someone, and I'm an example, to pick my concepts, pick my organism. So in my career, I started out studying zooplankton. I proceeded to insects. I've studied fish, birds, plants, microbes. That's taxa, transcending. In subject, I can study foraging, predator defense, cooperation, ovarian development. Pick your topic, pick your organism. And there's an advantage of doing that, because often a particular organism is the best one to study a particular topic, so that if you want to study a new topic, it's often good to move to a new organism. And believe me, I'm not comparing myself to Darwin in terms of personal attributes. That would be boring. I'm saying that the theory which served Darwin and allowed him to be integrative also allows the modern evolutionary biologist to be integrative. And this says something very interesting about this problem of information load. Back in Darwin's day, there was perhaps too little information, although, of course, there was a lot. Today, we have much too much information. We're buried by information. And yet, it's possible to function in this integrative mode throughout this full range. Darwin can do it, and the modern evolutionary biologist can do it. So somehow, this way of thinking that allows us to be so integrative is something which can exist independently of the amount of information available. And the reason is simple enough. It's because what the theory provides is a way of organizing existing information and seeking new information regardless of how much information is currently available. And that's why it's independent of the amount of information. For those evolutionary biologists who choose to study humans, they continue to function as extreme integrationists. The fact that they moved to humans as opposed to non-humans really makes no difference in their style of thinking. So at the same time that I've been studying the animals and the topics in the previous slide, I've been studying decision making, the nature of physical attractiveness, a great topic, the philosophical concept of the naturalistic fallacy, food sharing in hunter-gatherer societies, general concept of social transmission, so important for culture, altruism, the nature of stories, individual differences in personality, religion, human rights, impulsiveness. And the list, of course, could go on and on. So being humans or other animals, this way of thinking allows the professional scientist to transcend disciplines to this degree. So this is a thumbnail sketch at the level of professional activities. What researchers do. It's also possible to teach extreme integration in the classroom. For many years I've taught a class on evolution and human behavior, usually at the upper level. Recently I switched so that it's a freshman class for non-majors. And the last time I taught this, you can believe I had lots of majors, from anthropology, art, and biology to philosophy, physics, psychology, and women's studies, all different kinds of backgrounds. And in the first half of the class, I teach the basic principles of evolutionary theory. And in the second half of the class, we use the basic principles and we function as extreme integrationists. We study topic after topic, then they choose their own topic, and they have the greatest time talking about everything from attention deficit disorder to yawning. So this can be done at the undergraduate level. The students love this class. Here are some anonymous comments. So the students have nothing to gain from making these comments. And listen to these comments. So this is what students get after a single semester exposure. This course provides evidence that evolution is evident in everything. It revolutionized my way of viewing problems. This course changed the way I look at things in general. I try to see and understand them from an evolutionary perspective now. This course shows how positive evolution can be. It teaches you a great deal and increases one's interest. And I want you to focus on positive here, the fact that this person, and really the class in general, comes to see evolution as something which is a positive thing, not threatening, but positive. I came into this class not knowing a lot about evolution. I now have an entirely new outlook on how evolution can be applied to many aspects of life. So here's someone who came into the class not knowing much about evolution. And here's someone who came into the class who had a lot of background. I'd taken evolution classes from high school and never felt it was interesting. But this class changed all my views upside down. The most boring theories became interesting thoughts that I could relate to my own day-to-day life. And here's this on the actual form. She marked a 10 for how much the class has changed her view, with a little happy face, and she wrote, "It's not boring anymore." And I think that this really tells us something so very interesting when you compare this, which I can do reliably, class after class. There's nothing unusual about this, nor is it unusual in the sense that I'm the only one that can do it. There's others of my colleagues can do this. Can take a population of students without any expertise and do this time after time. How can we reconcile this with the famous inability to teach people about evolution that comes through in survey after survey? What is going on that we have such night and day kind of differences in response to evolution? Now, with the help of two experts in science pedagogy, Brian Alters and Craig Nelson, I was careful to quantitatively assess this class because it's so interesting to answer this question, basically. And of course, pedagogy can be studied scientifically along with anything else. And so we did before and after surveys. We assessed prior knowledge of evolution, importance of religion in their lives, everything from atheist to devoutly religious, political orientation from left to right, and also general thinking style without reference to subject matter. And in all of these cases, even though the students who took my course no doubt were a biased sample of the university population, and the university population was a biased sample of the general population, the fact was that the students varied more or less over the full range of responses for all of these measures. So I had everyone from atheists to the religiously devout, from political conservatives to liberals, lots of evolutionary background, very little, and so on, that took the class. And the results of the assessment are interesting. The course, of course, was highly successful at changing views. You could see that from the student comments, and that was also reflected quantitatively. But what was so interesting was that the course succeeded across the spectrum of religious and political beliefs. In other words, there was no correlation with what the religious values or political values of the student and how much they liked the course. Neither did the course alter their political or religious value. If they were devout coming in, they were devout going out. It did not challenge their faith in God, and their faith in God did not prevent them from appreciating the virtues of this theory. And even though evolutionary theory historically has been associated with right-wing ideological doctrines, there was no relationship. The left feminists and the people who dress in black were just as happy with evolution as the right wings. So it did improve general reasoning skills. When you measure what the kinds of thinking that we associate with scientific reasoning, which means that you don't regard everything as just facts, at the same time you don't think that everyone's just entitled to their opinion, that you actually need to evaluate stuff. Stuff can be right or wrong, and that there's a procedure for telling which is which. This kind of thinking actually was increased, apart from any particular subject matter, as a result of the class. So these are obviously results to die for as far as teaching is concerned. And so, how does this course work so well? I can show that it succeeds, and now let's try to think, why does it succeed so well? And there's a number of pedagogical devices which can be taught for any subject matter. If I had more time, I'm very interested in this subject, but I've left it out for lack of time. The real essence as to why this course works so well, I think, can be explained by these three words: unthreatening, explanatory, and useful. I managed to present evolution in a way which is, in the first place, unthreatening. It does not necessarily lead to dire consequences. In the second place, it's explanatory. It explains the world as it existed in the past and exists in the present. And in the third, it's useful. You can use the theory to make the world better, if that's whatever that means according to your dictate. And any theory that is an unthreatening, explanatory, and useful is going to be psychologically alluring. I'm always amazed when I look at discussions about teaching evolution, how much they work at driving in the facts of evolution. Oh, it's just, certain, almost no attention to the consequences. And one thing that you can say, actually, as an evolutionary biologist about all forms of mentality, including human mentality, is that it's consequence-driven. All forms of mentality are designed to produce adaptive outcomes. And so if you're asked to accept a belief which in your mind is going to lead to bad outcomes, even really bad outcomes, a threatening idea is like any other kind of threat. The impulse is to kill it or run away from it. And if you take the same idea and if you make it alluring, then the impulse is to embrace it. Neither one of those is scientifically respectable. We're supposed to accept ideas when they're true, regardless of the consequences. But certainly you want to work on the implications of what you're teaching someone. And if you could make it unthreatening, explanatory, and useful, then people will want to learn it. And the only limiting factor then becomes the intrinsic difficulty of the subject. And as it turns out, evolutionary theory is not intrinsically difficult. It's not like the theory of relativity, which is intrinsically difficult. You can teach the basic principle of natural selection in 5 minutes. And the big question is not what is it or does it happen, it's why should anyone make a big deal out of it? So it's so interesting to approach this at this level. Now, so what is it that they actually learn? What are the basic principles, the minimum basic principles that a person needs to get going to function as an extreme integrationist? I'm going to list these, and of course in the course it takes me about half the semester to go through them properly. I hope to go through them properly in the book that I write for this series. Here, of course, I have to go through them improperly. I'm going to dash through them in this lecture, and then during the subsequent lectures I will have a chance to return to these. But here is just a flyby, basically. And by far and away the most important concept to get across is the concept of adaptationism. That is the centerpiece of Darwin's theory. And I call it a third way of thinking in a way that I'm going to elaborate. It is so simple yet profound. Once I get the concept of adaptation across, it's important to elaborate upon it because the biological concept of adaptation is very different than the general concept of usefulness, the everyday concept of adaptation. And it turns out that many things that count as adaptive in the biological sense of the word are not at all adaptive. They're destructive in the everyday sense of the word. Biological adaptations are often short-sighted and selfish, and they lead to dysfunctional outcomes at larger temporal and spatial scales. And so it's like the folktale where the person is given a wish, and then the wish turns out very differently than they expected. When you could talk about adaptations, it does not lead to benign outcomes by any means at all. And so you have to be careful what you wish for with adaptations. And then the third point is that when we feature adaptationism, the importance of adaptationism, we're not saying that everything is adaptive. And this is the point that Stephen Jay Gould made again and again and again throughout his career. There's more to evolution than adaptation. Adaptation is something which evolves only by a very sort of messy process. And there's all kinds of stuff that happens, basically, that prevents organisms from being well adapted to their environment. And these three things taken together means that the very best that evolutionary theory gives you is a kind of a framework for asking questions in which there's more than one plausible alternative. It never just gives you the right answer straight away. And of course, I don't think any theory does. And so unless you can actually take these hypotheses and test them and then go back and revise the hypothesis and go through a cycle which we know is the scientific process, then you're dead in the water. And so you really have to do science. And this might seem to be elementary, but as we'll see, is in evolution circles about this. And then finally, the final point is that there's more to evolution than genetic evolution. So evolution, as Darwin knew it, there's three ingredients: phenotypic variation, heritability, and fitness consequences. The mechanisms of heritability might be genetic, or they might not. And so when you think of evolution in terms of the most basic ingredients, it admits certain psychological processes, developmental processes, and cultural processes, which count as fast-paced evolutionary processes. And so it creates an open-ended element, especially to human individuals as adaptive systems, as evolving systems, human cultures as evolving systems, which solve some of the problems that arise when we limit evolutionary thinking just to genetic evolution. So in a very fast way, that is the basic principles of evolution that I am to the students. Now, let me just try to go over this. I'm going to keep within my time limits here, so I might just skip over some things. But let me just go over this in a little bit more detail, beginning with adaptationism. And to make you believe, ask you to believe that you're a student in my class, because of course many of you, almost all of you, are highly distinguished in your own rights. But I think that it would be an interesting exercise just to imagine that you're an undergraduate student in my class and to see how I present these ideas to somebody who's often just encountering them for the first hand. So suppose that I place an object in your hand, and it could be a mineral, it could be non-living or living, and I ask you to explain to me its properties. And before Darwin, you'd have only two ways of explaining the properties of the of the object. Either you could use a theological explanation that this is God's handiwork, or a material explanation. I took it apart and it's made out of certain minerals and so on and so forth. These would be the only two ways that you would have to explain to me the properties of this object. And what Darwin's theory did was provide a third way of explaining the properties of living objects. In the case of a bird, for example, you could say the bird has the property it does because it enables it to survive and reproduce in its environment. There was a process of selection, there was variation, heritability, selection, and now this animal is well designed to survive and reproduce in its environment. Now, everyone knows that this kind of explanation is different than a theological explanation, but it's a little more subtle to say that this kind of explanation is different than a materialistic explanation. And the best way to get this across is by using the metaphor of a sculpture. If I were to hand you a sculpture made out of clay, you would never explain to me the properties of the sculpture by telling me all about the properties of the clay. There might be certain reasons why you could only make, the clay would certainly set certain constraints, but primarily the most interesting properties of the sculpture are based on the shaping process of the sculptress, not the properties of clay. And in just the same way, what the materials of organisms do, including its genes, to the extent that they give you heritable variation, that becomes a kind of a living clay that gets molded by the forces of survival, by the environmental forces of survival and reproduction. And there's something amazingly holistic about this. The holistic statement is that the parts permit the whole to have its properties, but they do not cause its wholes to have its property. And that is literally the case with heritable variation, is that they permit the organism to acquire properties by this process of adaptation, but they do not cause the organism to have these properties. Evolutionary biologists routinely make predictions about the properties of organisms without ever knowing a single thing about their genes or their material makeup. There's something amazingly holistic about it. And this is the proximate ultimate distinction in evolutionary biology, surely one of the most fundamental, and yet not acknowledged, not really appreciated by many people who are unfamiliar with evolutionary theory at all education. Now, I sometimes bring this home with a little exercise, which I find very instructive. So, knowing only a brief treatment like this, let's see how well you can employ adaptationist thinking as an example. So, reproduction is the name of the game in evolutionary biology. And it might seem that parents killing offspring would never evolve. Why on earth would any parent kill their offspring? Nevertheless, there's a number of environmental situations in which infanticide can be favored by natural selection. So what are they? I have the students turn to their neighbors, discuss it in groups of 3, and the hall erupts in conversation. You can do a little bit of thinking yourself. What are the environmental circumstances in which infanticide might be adaptive? And reliably, year after year, come up with what we can call the big 3 environmental factors favoring infanticide, which are lack of resources. If you don't have enough resources for you and your baby and perhaps previous offspring to survive, you're faced with a very tough choice. Quality, from an evolutionary perspective, one needs to raise offspring which themselves will have offspring. And so if an offspring is very unlikely to survive or reproduce themselves, then as difficult as it might be, then this becomes a context for infanticide. And then the third is uncertain parentage. This is often a problem which afflicts males and females, but in certain species such as bird, it's a problem that can afflict females. Is this really my offspring? And if it's not, then the tremendous investment of effort is not going to be warranted from an evolutionary perspective. All of these things follow the fact that natural selection parents maximizes their reproductive success over their whole lifetime, and this always involves a weighing of present reproduction against future reproduction. Now, I like to think that this exercise is simple but profound. Why? These are college freshmen. They have minimal knowledge of evolutionary theory. Hopefully they have no direct knowledge of infanticide. They have no knowledge of proximate genetic or psychological mechanisms that might underlie infanticide. And despite this, they were able to correctly deduce the major hypotheses that are in fact employed in the study of infanticide. And that is the power of adaptationist thinking. I've got my students going, basically, thinking as an adaptationist from the very start. And as for infanticide, so also for an infinite number of other questions. This is why Darwin could be an extreme integrationist. We could ask, why are males much bigger than females in some species, as in the elephant seals? Males are about 3 times bigger than females, or much smaller than others. This is a deep-sea anglerfish, and this little projection here is the living fishing lure that it dangles. Other fish come and get snapped up by this fish. This little projection here is the male, much smaller than the female. It searches the female out, bites her on the butt, and its lips fuse with her skin, and it becomes a living bag of sperm. And so in this case, the sexual dimorphism goes much the other way. Why do some animals blend into their background, as in this alligator snapping turtle, and another stand out, as in this amazing mandrill? How can we explain aging? Aging certainly seems dysfunctional. This is a wonderful picture of an ornithologist as a young man, and he's banding seagulls here. And this is one of the heroic biologists who spends his entire life working on a single study population. So here he is about 50 years later, and that's the same bird. That's the bird right there. She looks a lot better than he does. So why is it? Why is it that some species senesce in a year or two, and others can go for centuries? How can we explain this amazing variation which exists in all things that you might want to measure? This simple algorithm of adaptationism is enabling us not to come up with the direct right answer all the time, but is giving us a really good guess again and again and again for an infinitude of subjects. And if we can do this for the whole natural world, what about us? What on earth would exempt humans so that we could not use the same powerful explanatory tool in order to study our own species along with the rest of life? Now let me give you a similar exercise for adaptations. Be careful what you wish for. And then I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. But this is another fun exercise. I asked the students to list all of the traits that they associate with morality. Who would you regard as a morally perfect individual? And I get the list that you might expect: altruism, sacrifice, courage, bravery, and so on. One year, one person yelled out Jesus, who is indeed the exemplar of the morally perfect individual. And then list all the traits that you associate with immorality, and I got what you might expect: selfishness, murder, adultery, all of those things. And that same year, somebody yelled out fat bastard, the character in the Austrian Powers movies. And ever since then, I've had this disturbing image of fat bastard and Jesus together, and I can't really seem to get rid of it. And so now that we have this kind of image of morality and immorality, let's conduct 3 thought experiments. The first one is, what would happen if you placed one moral individual and one immoral individual together on a desert island? What would happen? And the students have no trouble with this. The answer is a no-brainer. The moral individual will become shark food within days. And so this points out the disadvantage of morality in social interactions. The morality seems to have this intrinsic disadvantage in social interactions. So experiment 2. What would happen if you placed a group of moral people on one desert island and a group of immoral people on another desert island? And this answer is also no-brainer. The moral group will thrive while the immoral group will self-destruct. So in just the same way that there seems to be a weakness associated with morality with respect to social interactions, within social interactions, it's just as fundamental that at the group level, at the societal level, morality is advantageous compared to immorality. Then experiment 3. Now what happens if we let one immoral individual paddle over to Moral Island and one immoral individual paddle over to Immoral Island? And that's a tough question because it's a messy combination of the clear-cut answers to the first two questions. And in a nutshell, this is multi-level selection theory, which I'll be talking about on the next 2 lectures. First for the biological world, and then the human world. And once again, simple but profound. I think the most profound insights are often the simplest. And here what we've shown is there is nothing unbiological about morality. So often evolution is portrayed as a theory which explains immorality and selfishness well, and altruism poorly, so that we have to explain altruism and morality elsewhere, somehow outside of evolutionary theory. But the real situation is that evolution has the resources to explain both the traits that we associate with immorality and the traits that we associate with morality. And that moral groups survive and reproduce wonderfully, even in purely biological terms. And of course, if you know anything about religion, you know that often the injunction is to be fruitful and multiply. So there's nothing unbiological about most religions or other moral systems. The problem with morality is not its biological adaptedness at the group level, but its vulnerability to subversion from within. So often, and of course it's more complicated than this, what we call immoral is predatory on what we call moral. And so what this means is that a desirable trait, prosociality, can either be adaptive or maladaptive depending on the parameters of the social environment. And if we know this well enough, then perhaps we can use this knowledge to improve the conditions for the expression of prosociality. This is the sense in which evolution becomes what was called by the student a positive theory, something that you can do something with. I mean, if we know the world in the past and in the present, we know, shit happens, basically. There's all kinds of bad things that happen. If your theory can't explain that, it's just not a good theory. But if you know that the socially desirable traits can be evolutionarily successful, and you know the conditions under which they can be evolutionarily successful, and you can produce those conditions, then you can actually cause these things to come into existence, and your theory has done a very useful thing. And I will try to elaborate on that kind of use of evolutionary theory in my last talk. Well, now I want to wrap this up because we want to leave some time for questions. I've already made the point that any theory doesn't just give you the right answer straight off. What it does is it gives you a set of intelligent alternatives, but then you need the scientific process to select among alternatives. And that's true for evolution just as any other theory. So you might think it doesn't need comment, yet there is endless debate about the difficulty of testing evolutionary and especially adaptationist hypotheses. This often parades under the phrase just so story, that when you give an adaptationist hypothesis, it's a just so story. And this occurs among evolutionists just as much as in other disciplines. I think it's an amazing phenomenon because what it does is that it takes difficulty and it makes difficulty replace falsehood as the basis of rejection. We're not saying that we can't do this because it's false. We're saying it's because it's so damn hard you can't function as a scientist and do it. And I think we really want to pay careful attention to this. And when we look at it closely, I'll bet you anything that it is actually like creationism. It is a barrier to inquiry. And that the reason that it exists where it does is because there's something that we're not supposed to touch. Okay? I think it's a kind of creationism that way. And if you look carefully, what you're going to find, and of course this is what philosophers and historians of science should be working on, and in some cases are, is that functional hypotheses, adaptationist hypotheses, are no more difficult to test than non-functional hypotheses. There's hypotheses about adaptationism which have been proven endlessly. And in any case, they can't substitute for each other, because if you know about the proximate ultimate distinction, what you know is that everything that evolves requires two explanations. It requires a functional explanation and an explanation in terms of proximate mechanisms. And the idea that you can't test things functionally, then you switch to it just won't work, because there's this complementarity of explanations. This is so fundamental to evolutionary theory. I'll be saying more about non-genetic evolutionary processes in future lectures, and so I want to they're important, of course, just to say briefly that one of the principal objections to evolution often goes by terms such as genetic determinism, for example. And the idea is that because evolution is genetic evolution, and there's assumed to be some kind of strong relationship between genes and behavior, then this somehow limits human potential, basically. We're stuck with our genes. There's nothing we can do about it. And so it becomes a limitation on human potential. And I think that a more careful understanding of evolutionary theory in a number of ways certainly makes this a false conclusion. And culture is so very important. There's all kinds of open-ended psychological processes, but these do not stand as alternatives to evolutionary theory. These must be understood from an evolutionary perspective. And so this leads to a concept of evolutionary social constructivism. That's a phrase that's so newly minted that it's not even published yet. So evolutionary social constructivism is another form of integration, which is almost entirely in the future. Okay, well, I've talked about integration as it's practiced by scientists, as it can be taught in the classroom. And I'd like to end with the idea of implementing this kind of integration at a campus-wide scale. That's what we're trying to do at Binghamton University with our evolutionary studies program. The website, if you visit it, begins, evolution is increasingly being used to explain the pageant of human life in addition to the rest of life on Earth. This consists of it's not a major, it's a program which can be taken by any student in the university. And it's a parallel curriculum which results in a certificate along with one's degree. There's over 50 faculty associated with it in 15 departments and growing. It has a teaching function, and it also is used to incubate collaborative faculty and graduate research. It will soon involve community-based research to solve practical in addition to basic scientific problems. And I think the best way to represent it is with the seminar series that we have every semester. Here's this spring's seminar series. And just imagine now that you were part of this program and you were attending all of these. We begin with Yale's own Linda Bartoshuk. Wonderful, wonderful work on genetic variation and taste perception, super tasters. I hope that you're familiar with her work. And then an archaeologist named John Hart, who thinks about archaeology from an evolutionary perspective. A computer person who does agent-based modeling from an evolutionary perspective. Very famous social psychologist named Tim Wilson at University of Virginia, social psychology and the subconscious mind. An ecosystem ecologist, wonderful work, Tom Whittam at Northern Arizona University. Very famous philosopher at the University of Michigan named Alan Gibbard. Microbial biologist at SUNY Stony Brook, studies Lyme disease from a very reductionistic perspective and also an evolutionary perspective. And then my co-editor, Jonathan Gottschall, a young literary scholar who was brave enough to write his thesis in a book on the Iliad from an evolutionary perspective, and then this edited book. And this list, which something like it appears every single semester, is notable for two reasons. The first is the degree to which scientists and scholars across disciplines are incorporating evolution into their work. And that list included some of the most established senior scientists today and some of the young, up-and-coming, the next generation of scientists. They've become sufficiently interested in evolution to very seriously incorporate it in their own work. And so this integration with evolution is already taking place at the level of research. And the second notable point is the degree to which such a diversity of subjects can be understood and enjoyed by a single intellectual community. The audience for these talks will be the same people They'll be from all subject areas, and they'll be from undergraduate students to faculty, a single intellectual community who are able to enjoy all of these lectures because they speak the common language of evolution. And so that's why I call this talk a sociological breakthrough. What I want to say is that the dream of integration, which has been reflected in the Terry lectures and is really the mission of the Terry lectures, is close to being realized. That evolutionary theory provides the basis for integration, perhaps not the only basis, but certainly a great one. That the extreme integration exemplified by Darwin is already being practiced at the level of individuals and small groups. And so what really needs to happen, and which can happen, the breakthrough is to establish what already exists at this small scale at a larger scale, both inside and outside the ivory tower. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. We're going to begin a question and discussion session right now. We can very easily go on for about half an hour if their questions persist. May I start off by simply asking you, you have very well accounted for Darwin's own early interest in group selection and some of the apparently falsifiable statements that you made in relation to this. Could you account for the reluctance of scientists after the 60s to really come to grips with group selection? What happened?
Well, I'll probably forestall the discussion of that until my second lecture, in which I'm going to talk about it in detail, but I can give a thumbnail sketch. I think Darwin was not infallible. He did say things which proved to be incorrect. He does sound amazingly modern when you read him. And in this case, he correctly perceived this dilemma, what I call the fundamental problem of social life, that although natural selection at the individual level produces many wonderful things, the insect that looks exactly like the leaf, the fish that hydrodynamically so efficient, has great difficulty explaining the traits associated with goodness and morality. These seem to be downright disadvantageous. And so he perceived this and he worried about it. And then he proposed group selection as the solution very clearly. What happened after that, and the history of evolution is so very interesting because many ideas which antedated Darwin sort of changed themselves superficially and then continued forward in superficially Darwinian terms. And so his followers became much less clear, and the whole concept of something being good for the individual, good for the group, good for the species, good for the ecosystem was lumped together. And there was a period of what's called naive group selection, very sloppy thinking about groupism, basically. And this was paralleled in the human sciences by a tradition called functionalism, in which people very uncritically thought that society was like an organism and more or less everything that you saw was good for the society. And it wasn't until the 1960s that this brought into question. And the reaction was very extreme, and I call it the last 50 years in evolutionary biology, the age of individualism in evolutionary biology. Now we're establishing a middle ground. I'll recount that in more detail. It'll basically be the subject of my next lecture.
What I thought we'd do, instead of me moderating this, is simply to have you direct your questions directly to Dr.
Leo,
Wilson.
aren't these microphones for recording purposes?
Yes, they are. If you will come down to the microphone or over to the microphone if you can, it might be heard better.
Printer has a
Good, Doctor.
I think you showed quite convincingly how you could work in this seminar setting to teach them adaptationist thinking. But I was wondering whether you have been equally successful to explain the more structural aspects of evolutionary theory. Like, I mean, if you take the birds example, actually most of the distinguishing features of the birds have evolved not in order to live as a bird, right? feathers and all the mechanics and so on of the wings, and so it has nothing to do primarily with flying and things like that. So I mean that seems to be, at least to me, more difficult to convey. Or have you found models to even teach those aspects?
I don't think it's necessarily difficult to convey, and it's fascinating in its own right. I do not give it priority in terms of the sequence ideas. I think I try to think very carefully. I think of it in terms of really building a conceptual structure in the mind of the student, and so it's very important what comes first and what comes second, and so on. And that's why one reason why I place adaptation first is because I think it has the largest payoff. These kinds of historical questions, and especially the concept of exaptations, as you would put it, where things come from, they do get entertained, but they are given a lower sort of a status in the framework. And I think that this is not to be the only education. What's intended to do is to get the student, bring the student into the subject. Then they will take, and do take, because they're very motivated to go on, a proper course, Mechanisms of Evolution, which really teaches evolution in a more rigorous way, a course in macroevolution. And so it's a question of an entry point, basically, in which I think the priority is governed a little bit by this idea of an entry point, not to slight the importance of those things at all.
Thank you for a clear presentation, also a creative way of using teaching evaluations that people can, I'm sure, benefit from. I was curious, Sumner of Yale, of course, was one of the first to call attention to issues of social Darwinism and the impact of Darwin upon the science of society, as it was called here. And Hofstadter's work often points out that early 19th or late 19th century sociology was also linked to evolution with notions of social progress, and that notions such as the Aryan race also were judgmental in regards to the value of group selection. So I'm curious as how you deal with the issue of deciding what is good and what is functional and what is not, given the long and tortured history of attempts to apply Darwin to society and to groups within it.
Yes, you're is this working? I think so. You're absolutely right. And I'll give a very abbreviated count here. The very first thing that I do in the class is to try to clear away some of the underbrush, basically, and to talk about the misuses of evolutionary theory. And there's two important points to make. One is to acknowledge that these misuses have taken place, and the other is to stress that they're not intrinsic to the theory. And so it's not as if everyone was nice before Darwin's theory and then became mean on the basis of the theory. Before Darwin, our own forefathers used the principle of divine right to displace and dispossess the Indians. So, so we have to be clear about these uses, and also, as intellectuals, I think we have to be able to see through them and dissociate the theory from its past uses. Now, there's a deeper problem, which is that I think many of you probably perceived, because it's easy enough, that this theory of group selection, multi-level selection, although it explains the traits that we associate with goodness, it also tends to limit them to within-group interactions. And between-group interactions are something else entirely. And so it's not as if group selection theory just produces niceness. In many ways, you go out of the frying pan of within-group interactions into the fire of between-group interactions. And so it's implicit in the theory that the dynamics of between-group interactions are going to be different and more challenging, even more challenging than the dynamics of within-group interactions. Now, that's a good thing in the sense that a theory has two jobs to do. One is to explain the world as it existed in the past and the present, and the other is to hopefully improve the world in the future. And we know that this problem of between-group interactions exists. I mean, any realistic person knows that this is true. And it's as bad for religious groups as it is for other kinds of groups. Actually, it's not worse, I don't think, but it's as bad. And so clearly, if your theory can't explain this double standard of us versus them, then it's not a good theory. In that sense, it's good that we can explain it. We'd also like to solve it, basically. So the theory, after we understand this, is there a way that we can structure between group interactions in order to foster cooperation? And that's a second interesting question. So I hope that I've adequately answered your question.
Any other questions, comments? Certainly on the issue of good and evil.
Well, my question is, let me start with a kind of story. When you were telling on Mondays I do this, on Tuesdays I do that, and on Wednesday I do the third thing, this reminded me somehow of I think Marx was talking about this in German ideology, that in the morning you were a farmer, at noon you're I don't know, fisherman, and in the evening you can be a critical philosopher. So this is a kind of utopia, which I mean is somehow sympathetic, but on the other hand I felt it's now, in retrospect, it looks threatening, and that's what one of the topics that dealt with.
It looks what?
It looks threatening, and I mean that's from the perspective of, like, Bert Rachel was once saying, Marxism looks threatening because it claims to know an answer to everything, and so in a kind of ironic way, he suggested we should put forward some questions where Marxists have no idea of an answer. So my question is, would you say, what cannot be explained from an evolutionary perspective? And I'm asking this especially with reference to multi-level selection. If where do units of selection come from? Should an evolutionary perspective be kind of amended with concepts from physics, self-organization, something like this? So I mean, there seem to be other paradigms with a universalist claim of we can explain it all, which somehow seem to be maybe in competition with an evolutionary perspective, but maybe they're just complementary. So would you say something about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to address it, because obviously it's something that one needs to think about. And I'm very sympathetic to the problem of a theory that explains everything, explaining nothing. So this is actually, there's two interesting kinds of answers. Let's say that you were to pose this question for a non-human species. What is it about Drosophila that we cannot explain by evolution? Okay? And in some ways the answer is nothing. Evolution can explain everything about Drosophila. Why? Because there's some sense in which evolution strives to be a complete accounting system. And so gene frequency change, for example, it includes drift, it includes selection, there can be all kinds of stuff. So we're not saying that everything is adaptive, but what you want to do is you want to get all the inputs and all the outputs, all the vectors basically, in order so that you know what's going to happen to the system. So in a broad sense, you're trying to have a complete accounting system. In that sense, it's good to explain everything. In a more narrow sense, then, that accounting system has to have various categories, so that you're not being so empty as to explain everything can be explained by selection, for example, because it might be drift, or it might be hitchhiking, or something like that. So as long as you have meaningful categories within your system, then you're not being empty, because you're being able to place things in these various categories. And I think that when we think about humans, we become much more complex in the inclusion of all kinds of processes which we think of as cultural and psychological. We have intentional thought. We have all kinds of sophisticated psychology, which is beneath conscious awareness. And then we also have processes of blind variation and selection, social experiments, many of which fail. All kinds of nonlinear processes which are not winnowed, basically, so they really fall under the category of complexity without resulting in adaptations. And so in some sense, we want a theory which incorporates all of these, just so that we could have a complete accounting system. In another sense, we need to have lots of meaningful categories within that system so that we don't suffer from the emptiness of saying that our theory explains everything. And religion is a good example, which I'm going to describe in more detail. The nice thing about evolution is that it offers several theories of religion. religion's individually advantageous, good for the group, cultural parasite. It can be maladaptive for some reason. It could be because it's suited to ancient environments. It can be a byproduct. So that's a sense in which you want to have a complete field of theories, but you also need to have these subcategories. And I think I'll probably leave it at that. But hopefully you'll be pleased with basically the way I try to deal with that in the case of human groups.
Do you know if anyone has studied the remarkable evolution of the digital computer, which has become so small and fast and cheaper and more reliable in such a short time?
I hope so. I don't know myself, but the evolution of technology is a great topic, and quite a few people do study that kind of thing. Another is the effects of computers on communication, and so what that does in terms of social organization, the kinds of groups that can exist connected by computers, which could never have existed before. So in some sense, computers have changed and this has been throughout history. Roads and other forms of navigation and things like that have been very influential in altering the population structure, which is important in evolutionary terms.
Hi, I'm a divinity school student, and I share that so you have a point of reference for my question. And I also work with a nonprofit that trains a good deal of people in this undergraduate age range. And I was fascinated by your statistics. Matter of fact, I just can't keep them out of my head or your assertions after the class, after you studied your class evaluations, etc., that those coming in with religious belief and certain political beliefs, by the time they were done this course, left completely unchanged in their viewpoints or even unscathed, it sounds, from what you're saying. So I can only imagine, in my own mind, one of two options: that the type of student that you have there at SUNY Binghamton is either so far on a, let's just say, a liberal political or religious spectrum that they were able to absorb this in without any type of hiccup. Or do you do some type of work in your classroom setting to make sure that someone who would come in with more of a stronger meta-narrative or more of a stronger, more rigid belief system, you from the get-go say, hey, you can have your deity and your evolution too. How much time do you spend trying to build that framework? Or is my first assumption correct that maybe your students are a type that I shouldn't be taking these statistics as far home as I'd like to?
No, I don't think my students are unusual, and at the same time, I don't go to special work to prepare them or counsel them or anything like that. So I think that the answer is more interesting than that. And the answer, now, as someone who's been studying religion hard and interacting a lot with religious believers and religious folks who are very interested in the science-religion interface, I taught a remarkable course called Evolution and Religion, in which the students came in, again, the full spectrum, and in the semester we studied a survey, which I'll talk about on in my third lecture. So we were studying evolution and religion hard in that class. And the reason that it's possible for a religious person to go through, as you say, without a hiccup, is that I think religious faith and belief, obviously you need to divide it up into a number of components. Part of that is the actual belief in supernatural agents and as something that's more than a social construction. And that, of course, is going to be challenged by an evolutionary account, because like any naturalistic account, then we're trying to explain religion in some secular fashion as a social construction. And yet, other parts of religious belief have to do with of course, pro-sociality, peace on earth, being part of something larger than ourselves, communicating our values to our children. And what fascinates me about religious discourse, whenever I listen to it, is that it's about 95% this other stuff. In other words, stuff which can be explained in frankly pragmatic terms. And so if you deliver a theory which is explaining how we might get these things in a practical way, a person who values them is going to love it. And so there's an affinity, basically, which is And I think often, and this depends on the particular kind of beliefs that a religious believer has, is I think that in many cases there's an implicit knowledge, awareness that the actual theistic beliefs are in some sense instrumental, okay, in the person. And that they're choosing religions, they're choosing this belief versus that belief in order that they have a good environment for their children, or that they can do this, or that they can do that. And that the actual practical benefits that they're looking for is enough in the forefront that overshadows basically the more conflictual aspects of taking this on. Is that an adequate?
Yeah, thank you.
This is a follow-up to the question about the legacy of social Darwinism and its perils. I generally support the use of evolutionary adaptive models for looking at society, but one of the dangers of doing that is a tendency to flatten the distinction between the existing or the adaptive or the functional and the good. So, for example, many kinds of social hierarchies, whether those hierarchies are based upon race or caste or gender, have been justified on the basis that these hierarchies are functional, or the societies that have these kinds of hierarchies are dominant. It seems like this kind of thinking can easily be used to justify these kinds of arrangements, and I'm wondering how you can avoid that.
Yeah, another great question, and I feel like giving a number of answers. At the highest level of intellectual discourse, this is the kind of question which should be and is being asked by people such as Alan Gibbard, a very well-respected moral philosopher. Okay? And so one point to make is that when we're talking about integration, the reason that philosophers are very much in the mix as far as evolutionary studies is concerned is because so many of these fundamental questions about ethics and epistemology and so on really does require, I mean, just cannot avoid the consideration of the fact that we are of evolution. And so the kind of question that you ask would be the kind of question which will be debated basically at the top. Okay? The typical answer that someone would give to that would say, oh, no, that would be the naturalistic fallacy. You can't derive ought from is. And I've done quite a lot of thinking on this, and that kind of usage is actually quite a bit simplistic. It's kind of like the use of a cross to ward off vampires, I think. And so the problem is more complex than that. But surely, if anything comes through, it's that nobody really would or should confuse what is adaptive, what evolves, with what is good. And I think that if you look at the whole concept of immorality, just in the common sense, everyday use of the term, it's implicit that immoral behaviors benefit the immoral individual. For heaven's sakes. We need evolution to tell us that? Obviously, no one would tempt to perform immoral acts if they did not benefit at the expense of others. And so if you're going to define morality just in the common sense of the term, then it's got to be other-oriented. The morality is something which is good for the group or good for the others or something. I mean, that is so axiomatic about morality that once you define that in an evolutionary context, you're saying is that immoral traits which we call immoral, at times they're evolutionarily advantageous, and that's why we see them. And again, I mean, evolution better make that prediction because otherwise it would predict that immoral traits don't exist, and that's not the case. So quickly you get to this kind of common sense middle ground in which the idea of it's natural, therefore it's good, is not really, I mean, it wouldn't be part of the mix. At the same time, there are, that's not to say that difficulties don't arise. And in a paper which I'm happy to give you, we talk about things like rape as an example which has been discussed, whether rape is an adaptive strategy in males. And if you look at the legal history of the status of rape and so on, you find out that very much there's a concept of the natural man, basically. What is a person, our conception of human nature, figures in what we regard as right and wrong, so that there is a connection between the facts of the world and morality. The naturalistic fallacy does not completely cut that connection. So I think the point is that this gets complex in a very interesting way. And it's something to dive into. It's not something to shy away from. And there's not any sense in which it leads to an outcome which you wouldn't actually be perfectly inclined to embrace just talking about it in non-evolutionary terms. I think this is a very interesting sense in which a person such as yourself would get very interested in evolution but would not change your basic values if you were to learn more about evolution. You'd find that you could actually make your point more effectively, basically, by talking in evolutionary terms. But you wouldn't change your basic perspective. I think that's.
I'm going to assert my prerogative as the moderator and limit us to one more question because we do have a reception following this. So I would ask you to.
Thankfully, I suppose you keep answering my questions as I stand here to ask one. Three on a match. Let's go for one more. Could you put a name and a face to moral or immoral groups? Would you go that far?
A name and a face to moral and immoral groups?
Groups, yeah. We're talking about moral groups, the moral island, the immoral island.
So you want me to name a moral group or an immoral group?
For example, please.
Well, I don't expect to be stumped, but let me just... that's an interesting question.
Try all groups are capable of both, being both, under the right circumstances.
It's probably easier to name immoral groups.
Well, no, I think I can do a little bit better than this. If you look, and there's really wonderful work, presumably I will get a chance to talk about it, certainly in private conversation. And with basically the cheater problem that I presented very briefly. And if you look at wonderful literature in the experimental economics literature, which basically they're cooperation games. And if you were to get a bunch of people around, they all can contribute to a common pot or not. It gets doubled and redistributed to everybody. Basically, you set up a prisoner's dilemma situation, which is possible of cheat. And in this situation, you get a mix of responses. And individual differences come across very strongly in most of these social situations. Big literature, multiple literatures on this, which basically say that human life, along with other species, is like an interspecific predator-prey interaction. They're the cooperators, and they benefit from their collective activities. And then they're the ones that break in, and they take, and you would expect this. Okay? So it's not hard to locate a slacker or a cheater. These folks exist, and probably exist in all of us because life is so heavily. So not only are there individual differences, but there's huge behavioral flexibility, so that any one of us would probably be a cheater in certain situations and not others. So you must acknowledge very important individual differences, and you also must acknowledge very important individual flexibility. Then that whole problem replicates itself as you go to the group level. You might have individuals who are very solid citizens. They're doing great things for their group, but that group is now working to exploit other groups. And this simply represents itself again and again and again. And so I think it's actually quite feasible and implicit in the whole subject that one thing about actually most populations, this is an interesting discovery. And we ecologists used to think of species as kind of uniform. They fill a single niche, for example. But more and more we're discovering that single species and single populations are very diverse, individual differences, which can be explained in the same way as species differences, basically. And so when it comes to cooperation, we always have this kind of eternal struggle that we're going to see between cooperation and defection, various of its guises. And we're going to see mechanisms which sort of weight things in the form of cooperation. Then we go up, we get these groups as corporate units, and all of those problems are going to exist again. And that's what it's like. And I think that when we assign morality and immorality of it, we can, because we use those words a lot. And of course, a lot of it depends on our perspective. So very clearly, if you're a member of a group which is exploiting another group, you're very likely to regard yourself as a highly moral individual. And so also everyone else be in your group. That's the problem, of course. And you see this playing itself out all the time. God bless America it would be a great example, or God bless any group. So I really think that there is a theory here which helps us to explain this sort of panoramic view of within and between group interactions, and then how we overlay that on the conventional and intellectual notions of morality and immorality is basically our challenge as intellectuals to do that. But the theoretical framework is there. And I think that if you just, with the experience that we have, both our everyday experience and our experiences as more systematic academics, it's just an amazing field of opportunity. And I'll try to convey that in my third lecture on human groups as adaptive units, and if we can use this framework to explain the nature of religion, basically.
Well, hopefully we can continue the dialogue at the reception at 124 Prospect Street, again, out the north.